Today, we become legends.
Smite's item system can be complicated to understand as a new player. With so many items in the game and only a handful of them being quote meta, new players often fall into traps of building items that might seem good on their face, but in reality are some of the worst items in the game for various reasons. This quick video will explain 5 items that I think are huge noob traps and are built way more than they should be, especially by new players. This doesn't necessarily mean you should never build these items. There are very few items, if any, that have absolutely no use case in the game, but these are 5 that I often see new players raving about when they aren't that great. So first up, we have probably the single biggest noob trap in the entire game, and that's the magical lifesteal item BANCROFT'S TALON. This item is an absolute favourite of noobs, and while it can be useful on certain characters, it has no place being as widely built as it is on standard burst mages. The core issue with BANCROFT'S that isn't obvious when you first start playing is the way magical lifesteal works. In Smite, lifesteal is subject to a mechanic called the AoE lifesteal coefficient. In simple terms, all damage that is done in an area of effect instead of to a single target is reduced to only 1/3 of the normal lifesteal value. This happens for AoE abilities regardless if you're hitting more than one target or not, meaning you have to hit at minimum 3 targets to get back to the normal amount that you would be getting for hitting one target with a single target ability or basic attack from lifesteal. This isn't a major issue for physicals because besides Soul Eater, physical lifesteal doesn't work on abilities, only basic attacks, which are almost always single target. With this AoE lifesteal coefficient considered, BANCROFT'S TALON actually only has 5% base lifesteal and a little under 12% even at full passive. When sustaining from minion waves, this is actually fine since you can hit 6 targets at once, but the problem arises in that Smite is a PvP game, and in teamfights you are rarely going to hit more than 3 targets, usually only 1 or 2, and so you aren't getting anywhere near as much lifesteal as you would think in teamfights, which leads to this item being really weak for actually fighting enemy gods. Lifesteal in general is overvalued by new players, but it's this AoE lifesteal coefficient that really makes this item worse than it appears to be on its face. Sure, it gives a lot of power, but if you're building lifesteal, you're aiming to not be at low health anyway, and so most of the time the stats on this item are worse than competing offerings for mages at the same price. This changes for certain characters as I mentioned, such as Anubis who gets a 99% lifesteal boost from his passive, or magical ADCs that use basic attacks which are single target and so get full lifesteal just like hunters do with their lifesteal options. And it has some pretty solid glyphs too, but on generic burst mages, this item is heavily overvalued by new players. Sticking with mage items for a hot minute, next up we have Gem of Isolation, which is another item that new players seem to value quite highly, although not quite as highly as BANCROFT'S. But the item itself is hot garbage and should almost never be built. It has even less applications than BANCROFT'S does. For starters, the base stats on this item for the cost are some of the worst in the entire game. It comes with 90 power, 200 health and 10% CCR for 2700 gold. At that price point, you have items like Book of Thoth, Tablet of Destinies, Soul Reaver, all of which are actually cheaper than this garbage on a stick. For only 150 gold more, you can get Rod of Tahuti, which is insanely better and has glyph options. But what about that OP slow passive? Yeah, it's not OP whatsoever, it's one of the worst passives on any item in the game. A 30% slow might seem really good, but with the way most burst mages play in Smite, a short slow won't actually do anything for you, as you play for 1 or 2 abilities hitting quickly and then backing off to wait for cooldowns. This item was made even worse somehow in the year 10 patch when they put an internal cooldown on the effect. This sort of made sense for Frostbound, the physical equivalent of this item, because basic attacks have no cooldown, but since this relies on abilities that already have a cooldown, this just made the item even worse and more clunky. Terrible stats for the cost and a bad passive. There's basically zero reason to ever build this item, yet I see new players buying it somewhat frequently. Next up is not a full item, but a glyph for an item, and that's Jolton's Vigor. Jolton's Wrath itself is one of the best items in Smite, so I can see why people might end up picking up this glyph. But it suffers many of the same ills as BANCROFT'S, because this glyph gives ability lifesteal, which again is reduced to 1/3 of the original value by default. This is even worse than with BANCROFT'S, because the vast majority of the time you are dropped below 40% health to activate this effect, it's because you're in a fight with an enemy god and not just healing off of minions with BANCROFT'S. This means that most of the time, this 30% ability lifesteal is actually just 10%. And again, lifesteal is overvalued as a stat by new players in general, probably because they take bad fights and get poked out a lot, so they feel the need to grab some sustain to equalize that. I get it. But don't build this glyph. Jolton's Cunning is infinitely better in almost every situation. This effect is barely worth the 600 gold you spend on it, never mind when you compare it to Cunning. Our second to last item on the list is one that seems practically designed to be a noob trap, and that's the alternate timeline. This is one of the 2 starter item upgrades of Sands of Time, the most popular mage starter, at least right now, so I can see why some new players might want to pick this up. It's similar to the lifesteal argument, since new players often take more poke or get caught out of position more than experienced players do, and so might want this effect that resurrects you after dying. The issue with this item is twofold. One is obvious, the internal cooldown of this item is 6 minutes. Considering starter items require level 20 to upgrade, they only come online at around 20 to 25 minutes in most Conquest games, maybe a bit faster in casual modes. But casual modes often end quicker, so this is kind of equalised. This means that to get more than a couple of uses out of this item, the game has to go 40 plus minutes, which is very rare. However, you could make the argument that you only need this effect to work in one teamfight for it to potentially win you the game with the revive. The problem with that argument is that this effect almost never works as intended. Most of the time that you die in a teamfight, you are out of position, getting dived, or have already lost the fight. In which case, the enemy just waits 1.75 seconds for you to revive at 25% health and one-shots you, resetting your timer to 6 minutes and making your starter item, the most powerful item in your build most of the time, completely useless. If anything, the base stats on this item are what make it attractive. 70 power, 45 of each defenses, and 10% CDR is really good base stats, but not enough to justify a passive that does nothing in most games. I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen this item effect actually do something useful in its 2 years so far in Smite. I get the idea of wanting safety against making a mistake, but don't build this item. It's hot garbage and rarely works. Try to work on your positioning and getting poked less instead of buying this. And finally we have SPHINX'S Baubles, which is an interesting one since on its debut this item was actually crazy good. However, on release it gave 20% extra CDR and now only gives 10%, half the effect it used to, plus this item was almost exclusively built on tanks back then, and now the item reduces your protections by a percentage, making it close to unviable for tanks and only really buildable on damage dealers. But for only 10% extra CDR, this item just isn't worth it. That's only going to take between 1 to 2 seconds off your cooldowns tops, maybe even less than that. Combine this with the fact that cooldown reduction is less available to damage dealers as it is to tanks, as well as the horrible base stats for the cost on this item, and you have a package that is rarely worth building. I think the reason this effect might be attractive to new players is because they see that it increases a cap and are like, this must be really good, it's practically breaking the game. But in reality, with a better understanding of how stats and builds work in Smite, you begin to realise how little this item is actually providing you compared to other options. It isn't completely useless, but it's overvalued from new players for sure. But that's 5 items that are complete noob traps in Smite and why you shouldn't build them. Are there any other items you guys think are overbuilt by new players that should have been in the video? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.